On April 14, 1912, a ship considered practically unsinkable was crossing the Atlantic with more than 2,200 people on board. A few hours later, only 20 lifeboats would be adrift, carrying 705 survivors on a dark, freezing ocean. Official records, eyewitness accounts, and discoveries on the ocean floor reveal, minute by minute, how that night really unfolded. Before we reconstruct the Titanic's final hours, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow every detail of this chain of decisions that changed the course of maritime history. On the night of April 14th, the Titanic follows an almost perfect routine, carrying on board three very different worlds: first, second, and third class. In the grand first-class lounges, dinner winds down with quiet conversations and clocks marking the end of the day. In second class, travelers see the voyage as a concrete chance for work and a fresh start. In third class, immigrant families enjoy their last moments of normal life before reaching the new world. Meanwhile, ice warnings reach the ship by wireless and are passed up to the bridge with different levels of urgency. The records show that even with these alerts, the course and speed remained almost unchanged. In the engine room and boiler rooms, work goes on at full intensity, feeding the power that keeps this entire floating microcosm in motion. As the night wears on, the Titanic keeps up her speed, plowing through a stretch of the Atlantic known for heavy ice fields. Multiple iceberg warnings are received by wireless and noted on the charts, but they do not lead to any major change of course or reduction in speed. The unusually calm sea makes spotting ice even harder, with almost no waves breaking against the floes. For most passengers, nothing feels out of the ordinary. The lounges are quiet, the decks nearly empty, and the biting cold is just another detail of the crossing. On the bridge, the officers put their trust in the ship's watertight compartments and the rigor of her design. The final hours before the collision unfold in apparent order, while the gap widens between what people think is happening on board and the real risk growing silently in the dark. As the night approaches 11 p.m., the air and water temperatures drop even further, closing in on freezing levels. Reports from other ships speak of ice fields and large bergs in the area, yet the Titanic maintains the speed of an express liner on her maiden voyage. The lookouts, with no binoculars, rely solely on their own eyes to pick out any obstacle in the darkness ahead. The extremely calm sea, later described by survivors as a sea of glass, further reduces the visual clues of danger. On the inner decks, very few people imagine that the ship is cutting through a zone of increasing risk. Technically, nothing seems to be failing. The engines run smoothly, the lights burn bright, and operations follow the expected discipline of a great ocean liner. Around 11:40 p.m., the Titanic's lookouts spot a dark shape dead ahead, something that does not match the sky or the sea. The lack of binoculars and the mirror-calm water cut the reaction time down to just a few seconds. The warning bell is rung, and the bridge receives the message: "Iceberg right ahead." The emergency maneuver begins, with rapid orders to swing the bow off and reduce power to the engines. Technically, the ship manages to avoid a head-on collision, but her starboard side passes dangerously close to the ice. The result is a long scraping contact that tears open the hull in several places below the waterline, starting a chain of flooding that almost no one on board yet understands. When the hull scrapes along the iceberg, most passengers feel only a slight shudder. In some lounges, glasses tremble on the tables and people glance around, unsure where the sound came from. Down below, however, the impact is far more obvious. Icy water begins pouring in through multiple openings along the starboard side. Officers and engineers move through narrow passageways to inspect the damage and return with quick measurements of rising water in several compartments. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, sailing on this maiden voyage, needs only a few minutes to realize that the damage goes beyond what the Titanic's buoyancy can handle. At this point, most people still believe the ship has simply bumped into something and remains essentially safe, while the technical reality already points to an irreversible outcome. In the minutes following the impact, soundings confirm that several of Titanic's forward compartments are flooding rapidly. Thomas Andrews studies the ship's plans and concludes that the damage reaches past what the watertight system can bear. He tells the officers that the liner cannot stay afloat, even if she still appears stable on the upper decks. The captain begins to focus his decisions on organizing the crew and preparing the lifeboats. At the same time, stewards move through the corridors, waking passengers and directing them toward the boat decks. From a technical standpoint, the sinking is already considered inevitable, but that reality is still far from the minds of most people on board. With confirmation that the ship will not remain afloat, the bridge orders the boats to be prepared and the passengers to be organized by section. The rule, women and children first, begins to be applied on the boat decks, especially in first and second class. At first, many passengers treat the embarkation as a purely precautionary measure, since the Titanic is still brightly lit and apparently steady. Some lifeboats are lowered with empty seats, a direct result of doubt about how serious the damage really is. Crew members have to insist that passengers leave their warm cabins for small open boats in the dark. This gap between the feeling of safety and the true technical situation marks the first minutes of abandoning the ship. The first boats on the starboard side start to go down with relative calm, still leaving spaces unfilled. Survivors later recalled how many hesitated to step off a brightly lit liner into tiny craft on a black, freezing sea. Meanwhile, third-class passengers face more physical barriers and less information as they try to reach the boat decks. Down in the machinery spaces, pumps are started in an effort to slow the advance of the water, but the calculations show this will only buy time. On the wireless, the distress call is repeated and begins to be picked up by ships in the area. The contrast between the crew's intense work and what many passengers see as overcautious preparations defines this moment in the evacuation. In the wireless room, the operators confirm that the Carpathia has answered the distress call and is altering course to assist the Titanic. The distance, however, means she will arrive only hours after the estimated time of sinking. On the boat decks, officers fine-tune the loading, with different interpretations of women and children first on each side of the ship. While some boats leave with empty seats, others are held back, waiting for more passengers to fill them. Second-class passengers begin to reach the boat areas in greater numbers, torn between curiosity and doubt. The ship's band is positioned on one of the first-class decks, playing to keep a sense of calm. All this happens while the slight list of the ship becomes more noticeable to those who are paying close attention. The bow's downward tilt becomes obvious, even to those on the upper decks. The band keeps playing in the first-class areas, helping to maintain a feeling of order as passenger movement intensifies. Accounts suggest that some people still believe they will return to the ship later, while others already sense that time is running out. Below, engineers and firemen continue working beside the rising water, holding back the inevitable for as long as they can. From a historical perspective, every minute in this sequence helps us understand how decisions, risk perception, and technical limits came together that night. If you want to follow this reconstruction clearly, minute by minute, make sure to subscribe and like the video so more people can discover this kind of historical content and see the sinking in detail. As flooding advances in the forward compartments, Titanic's list becomes more and more pronounced. On the upper decks, anyone watching closely can already tell that walking toward the bow now takes extra effort. A significant number of boats have left the ship's side, reducing the remaining seats for those still on board. Second and third class passengers start to reach the boat deck in larger groups, often unsure how many boats are left. In the machinery spaces, pumps and valves continue to operate, but the speed of the flooding is now greater than what the systems can hold back. From this moment on, every minute lost directly cuts the chances of getting a place in a boat for many of those still on the ship. As time passes, the number of boats still on board drops quickly. On deck, the line between those already safe and those still on the ship becomes painfully clear. Third-class passengers finally reach the boat deck more often, but now they face fewer open spots and heavier crowds. The bow settles deeper, bringing the forward decks closer to the water, while the stern rises slowly but visibly. Inside, furniture shifts, corridors feel more slanted, and going downstairs becomes harder than climbing up. Technically, the ship has entered a critical phase of flooding, with very little time left for any kind of orderly evacuation. As the last wooden lifeboats are prepared, the boat deck grows more and more crowded. Many passengers finally grasp that there will not be enough seats for everyone on board. In some areas, officers are forced to physically hold the line to keep the crowd from surging toward the rail. Third-class passengers who have made it this far often arrive too late for many of the remaining places. The bow is now so low that part of the forward well deck is already touching the sea. This is the moment when the perception of risk changes for good. For hundreds of people on the Titanic, it is no longer about choosing a boat, but about being trapped on a doomed ship. With most of the boats already gone, many passengers understand they will not find a place in any lifeboat. The focus slowly shifts to keeping order at the stern, where the deck still sits above the water. Some crew members try to ready the collapsible boats and improvise new ways to stay afloat, even as the hull keeps sinking by the bow. Rockets continue to be fired into the night, sending out distress signals to any ship on the dark horizon. Inside, the forward corridors become impassable, forcing anyone still below to hurry up to the higher decks if they want any chance at survival. The Titanic remains lit, but the difference in height between bow and stern makes it clear that the final stage of the sinking is close. With almost all the wooden boats already in the water, most of those still on board move toward the Titanic's stern. It is the only area that remains above the sea, despite the steep angle of the bow. Crew members work frantically to prepare the remaining collapsible boats, stored in less accessible positions, a process that demands intense manual effort with almost no time left. Inside, many forward sections have been abandoned. And corridors that were once elegant passageways have turned into critical escape routes. In the engine room, part of the staff is ordered out, while a few engineers stay behind, monitoring systems right up to the last possible moment. Structurally, the ship is in an advanced stage of losing buoyancy, yet she still has electric power and a partial sense of order on the upper decks. With the bow now sunk far below the forward decks, Titanic's angle becomes extreme. Moving toward the stern is practically the only option left for most of those still on board. Inside, some areas remain fully lit, while others already suffer flickering and partial blackouts. Heavy equipment, furniture, and loose objects slide toward the lower end of the ship, increasing the physical danger for anyone still inside. Outside, the stern is packed with people clinging to railings, structures, and any handhold they can find. The final phase of the sinking approaches quickly, with electrical power and the ship's structural integrity under enormous strain. As the hull's angle grows sharper, the stern deck becomes the main gathering point for those still alive on board. Some collapsible boats finally reach the water, while others are thrown down only partially loaded and must be reorganized once they float free. The electric power is still on, but interior and exterior lights dim and surge, showing clear signs of failure.
Signaled the beginning of the end. Under the electrician's feet, the deck...
In multiple accounts, passengers describe the brutal difficulty of staying on their feet, grabbing railings, deck ventilators, and any fixed structure to avoid sliding toward the bow. Down below, flooding pushes further into the midsection of the ship. At this moment, Titanic is on the brink of shifting from progressive flooding to the final structural breakup. In the final moments before the hull breaks, Titanic's angle becomes so steep that moving without support is nearly impossible. Many survivors later said they climbed all the way to the stern to avoid being swept away by the water rushing in at the bow. The electric system now fails more often, with brief blackouts followed by partial returns of power. At times, the ship is left almost completely in darkness except for a few remaining lights. Inside, seawater invades areas once associated with the height of luxury on an ocean liner. Outside, the mass of people gathered at the stern and the near-vertical position of the hull show a structure under extreme stress seconds away from giving way. When the bow sinks beyond a certain point, Titanic's structure reaches maximum stress around the center of the hull. Survivor accounts describe the ship appearing to right herself briefly before the stern suddenly lifts even higher. In that process, internal structures, already weakened by flooding, fail between the midship decks. The ship tears in two large sections. The bow plunges rapidly, while the stern remains for a moment on the surface. For those still on board, the sensation is one of violent jolts, deafening metallic noise, and a sudden shift in angle. Seen from a distance, the whole sequence unfolds in just a few minutes, marking the beginning of Titanic's final disappearance beneath the North Atlantic. After the breakup, the stern section stays afloat for a short time, but without the support of the bow. With no real buoyancy and a shattered structure, this part of the ship also begins to sink quickly. Witnesses in the lifeboats recall the stern rising almost vertically before the hull vanishes suddenly beneath the surface. All around, hundreds of people are thrown into the freezing sea, many wearing life jackets but exposed to water temperatures near freezing. Most of the boats remain at some distance, some crews afraid to approach for fear of being pulled down by the suction. This is the moment when Titanic ceases to exist on the surface, and the fight for survival shifts entirely to the lifeboats and the dark water around them. Right after the stern disappears, the area of the sinking turns into a field of wreckage and human bodies in the water. Life jackets keep many people afloat, but water close to 32 degrees Celsius begins to take its toll within minutes. The more distant boats hear a mass of voices crying for help, described by survivors as a single continuous roar, impossible to separate into individual cries. Some boats consider going back, but overcrowding and fear of being swamped makes many hesitate. Close to the site of the sinking, groups cling to pieces of wood, doors, parts of the deckhouse, and in some cases to the collapsible boats themselves, half submerged. This interval, between the ship's final plunge and the fading of the screams in the water, lasts only a few minutes but becomes one of the most haunting memories for those who survived. Within minutes, the mass of voices in the water starts to fade, replaced by isolated cries and, finally, by an almost complete silence. The water temperature makes survival without shelter brutally short, and this explains why so many life jackets never led to rescue. In the lifeboats, the cold is also relentless. Soaked clothes, constant wind, and breath hanging in the dark air. Some boats edge cautiously closer to one another to redistribute passengers and attempt small, focused searches. Far off, at a certain moment in the early hours, some crew members report seeing the lights of a ship on the horizon, possibly the Carpathia, closing in. From that point on, the priorities in the boats are split between keeping warm, waiting, and trying to fix the direction of the approaching rescue. In the hours after the sinking, the lifeboats drift in the intense cold, with most survivors sitting in silence. At some point during the night, a few crews spot a stronger light on the horizon, different from the fixed stars above. It is the RMS Carpathia, answering the distress call and pushing her engines to the limit as she heads for the reported coordinates. The lifeboats, scattered over a wide area, try to remain visible, using lanterns or improvised signals whenever possible. As time passes, the darkness gives way to a pale glow in the east, revealing the distance between the boats more clearly. The arrival of the rescue ship does not erase the loss of the Titanic, but it marks the beginning of the second chapter of that night, the recovery of the survivors.
Steady now, bring her right up to the net. Grab hold there. We have her. Help us up.
With daylight now settled, the Carpathia begins a careful sequence of maneuvers to bring each lifeboat alongside. Her crew throws down rope ladders, nets, and lines to help survivors weakened by cold and exhaustion climb aboard. Many accounts describe the stark contrast. A warm, brightly lit ship receiving people drained by hours in small open boats. Officers and crew on the Carpathia log each boat, its order of arrival, and the condition of those on board. Blankets, hot drinks, and makeshift spaces in lounges and covered decks are organized to receive everyone. The operation takes hours and shows that, even after the loss of the Titanic, there was still a structured rescue effort that ensured the survival of 705 people. After recovering the lifeboats, the Carpathia heads for New York with survivors spread across decks, salons, and corridors. The crew records names, classes, and physical conditions while handing out blankets and hot drinks to fight off the chill of the early morning. Officers mark on the nautical charts the approximate position of the sinking, registering the spot where the Titanic disappeared. For many survivors, the contrast between the safety of the new ship and the memory of those final hours is immediate and hard to process. Out at sea, the disaster site soon looks like just another stretch of Atlantic, with no visible trace of the lost liner. From that moment on, the story of the Titanic lives mainly in the memories of those who were on board and in the official records produced in the hours and days that followed. The Carpathia nears New York Harbor carrying 705 survivors from Titanic's last hours. On the pier, crowds gather to welcome relatives, search the lists of names, and hear first-hand accounts of the sinking. The testimonies collected there and during the later official inquiries lay out the sequence of that night. The impact with the iceberg, the lifeboats leaving partially filled, and the ship breaking in two as she went down. The mix of overconfidence, an insufficient number of lifeboats, and harsh environmental conditions turned that crossing into a benchmark for maritime safety in the 20th century. More than a century later, whenever we talk about Titanic's final hours, memory returns to that April night when a ship considered practically unsinkable vanished, leaving behind only lifeboats, documents, and the stories of those who lived to tell what they saw.